Thank you. All right, good morning. Thank you for coming to my session. I know there's no others running at the same time, so I don't have a lot of competition, but thank you anyway. Today I'm presenting BiscOT for the BiscOT, which I think may be the best pun I've seen in the talk titles so far, so I'm going to self-appoint myself winner of that. Slightly disappointed they didn't serve biscuits at morning tea, but anyway, we'll move on. So as a bit of an introduction, hello, I am Cairo. I used to work as a cybersecurity advisor at one of the world's largest mining companies up until July of this year. And it was my job there to assess technology across both enterprise and the industrial or operational parts of the business. I'm currently working for Octopus Deploy, so I have moved from digging into the dirt up into the cloud. If you're interested in DevOps and code automation, you can probably don't talk to me because I don't do the code automation stuff. I'm in the cybersecurity team. I also have a CISP and a Bachelor of Arts. And if I seem familiar, it may be because I have been involved with a whole bunch of acronyms, which you can see up on the screen there. So to get into what I'm actually talking about today, I'm going to start with some really basic definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk you through the controls that my team would be interested in when we were doing risk assessments on operational technology. And then I'll take you through a slightly vague, not proprietary case study from my time at my previous employer. So I'll start off, what actually is operational technology? This is hardware or software that controls or monitors physical processes. So this is what we're talking about in terms of manufacturing, mining, utilities. It's not, logging onto your laptop on your corporate network, sending some emails, writing some Word documents, playing in Excel. We're actually talking about things that control big crushers, conveyor belts, anything kind of in a factory setting, those kinds of things. And also the safety and monitoring systems that surround them. So there's a lot of quite dangerous things going on in these environments, and there's people in there that need to interact with that technology as well. So there's monitoring and safety systems that look at things like air quality, that look at seismic activity if you are drilling down into the earth, and all of those kinds of things that are going to help keep people and keep the processes safe. So this presents a slightly different challenge to traditional IT. Generally speaking, the systems are quite a lot older, and they're also quite a lot harder to patch because they are usually ridiculously old. And also you've got really small change windows. And, if you want to take something offline for 10 minutes, sometimes you're looking at $10 million of lost production in that time. So very, very small change windows. You're also heavily reliant on vendors in this space. There's a lot of technology in this space that's basically built by two people in a shed who probably used to work for a mining company and thought, I can solve this problem. And they've built a little black box, they've put their software on it, and they stick that in your environment. You probably don't really know what's on it, and they're probably the only people that actually make that product. So you don't actually have a competitor that you can go to. And finally, and this is probably the most important one, when we're talking about the impacts of cybersecurity incidents, when it comes to operational networks and operational technologies, the impact of those incidents is quite a lot greater than in a traditional enterprise environment. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars lost very, very quickly. And even more important, in terms of people and safety, your impacts are looking at injury or possibly even death. So for example, I did a risk assessment on a mine in Mongolia. It's an underground mine. It has a shaft with a lift in it that takes people underground. There's 200 people in that lift at any one time. And if something goes wrong with that, you've got 200 people who could possibly die if something goes wrong. So there's a little bit more pressure to actually do things right in these kinds of environments. So what is a risk? Please do not actually read the picture. I'm not a mathematician, but I don't think that checks out. So in really brief terms, a risk has three components. You have an asset, which is anything of value. You have a threat, which is something that wants to have an impact on that asset. And you need a vulnerability, which is a weakness. So to steal a metaphor from Casey John Ellis, an asset is your face. A threat is someone wanting to punch you in the face. And a vulnerability is your inability to actually block that punch. And when we're assessing a risk, we're also looking at both the likelihood of a threat occurring and the consequences. So this is how likely is someone to punch you in the face and how much would it actually hurt. And obviously that's going to impact how you judge that situation and what you do to avoid it. So performing a risk assessment in an operational environment, these are the 8 domains that my team would traditionally look at. A bit of a disclaimer, we haven't actually based this on a specific framework or standard or anything like that. It doesn't map strictly to anything. It's just what we put together and what we worked with and what we found was a good thing to do. So, bit of a disclaimer there. So I'm going to take you through the key controls for each of these domains, and I'll kick off with network segregation and segmentation, which is not a tongue twister at all. So first up, one of the major controls that we're looking at in an OT environment is actually having it segregated off from your enterprise environment. And a big part of that is making sure, and this sounds a little straightforward, that all of your operational systems are actually on your operational network. It can be really easy to plug that stuff into your corporate network, and then there's different considerations that you need to have. And an enterprise network probably has less of a consideration of uptime. It can go down without it being a big deal. It's more of a big deal when something goes down that's an OT system. So making sure your OT systems are on your OT network. Making sure your OT networks are not actually connected directly to the internet, because then probably a whole bunch of you folks in this room would try and get to it. Usually you want to have access through a DMZ or a data diode or a unidirectional gateway, rather than having a direct connection from your enterprise environment into your OT environment. And going along with that, no dual home devices. So don't go to all the trouble of segregating your networks and then plugging something into both networks and wondering why things go wrong. The next step then is segmentation. So within your operational network, actually having segments within that network to separate things out that don't need to connect to each other. If you actually have that in place, then if you have an incident with, let's say you get malware on your truck, you don't want that malware to then get to your drill. Seems pretty straightforward. So segmenting that out with VLANs, having things separated out rather than just all in one big mishmash of a network, always a good idea. And finally, one thing that we would tend to look for, if you've got low value assets, so like little monitors that are looking at things that you don't necessarily need to have real-time data on, or that's not high value data, keeping those out of your actual internal network and pushing them onto public 3G or 4G, even 5G now that we're all getting vaccinated, is going to make it a lot easier to keep those kinds of slightly dodgy, maybe not the most secured sensors off your actual internal network. And this is a big thing now also with a lot of vendors. When they create sensors and monitors, they want to be streaming data out to their cloud service, so it needs an internet connection. You probably don't want that in your operational network, so just push it out to the cloud, stick a SIM card in it, let it send off to the vendor's cloud, and you're not going to have too much of a drama. So domain 2, vendor and third-party management. The first one is making sure you've actually got endorsed remote access solutions to have your vendors actually accessing your network. You do want vendors getting into your network because 9 times out of 10 they're the ones providing the support for whatever black box it is that they've sold you. And you want them actually patching and updating that and doing support when they need it. But you don't want them just logging in. You don't want to have TeamViewer on all your engineering workstations. That's not going to end well. Like a particular Florida water treatment plant. Yeah, that was a good one. Again, you don't want direct access to your operational networks. Actually make sure your remote access solutions abide by your network segregation requirements. Don't have third-party devices connected to your operational network. This is a really big one with vendors that want to come in and patch a piece of hardware. They're going to bring in a USB that they've taken to 100 different mine sites that they've probably plugged into their laptop that they're on while they're perusing whatever websites they do in their spare time. And then they're going to bring that into your operational environment and plug it into your hardware that you need to keep your trains running. Generally not a good idea. And this also goes for your internal staff as well, because a lot of them will have a mobile phone that at some point they're going to want to charge, and they're going to plug it into any USB that they can find. regardless of what that actually connects to. And finally, all vendor and third-party access is monitored and logged. This also goes for physical access. So if you have people coming on site, in person, actually doing work, making sure you have them sign in, you have someone accompany them. And it also goes for their logical access as well. I think a few hackers that I know often like to use the phrase no logs, no crimes. You want logs so you can tell when there's crimes. So domain 3, identity management and infrastructure access. Now, a lot of this does line up with enterprise access management. So a lot of it's going to be pretty basic access management, the stuff we all say is really easy and then none of us actually do very well. So first up, you want to restrict physical access to your infrastructure. Take a look, lock, leave approach. Don't leave doors to data centers open. Don't have, engineering workstations out in the middle of a workplace where people can just log in and start messing with your trains, all that kind of stuff. And then your basic access management. So only grant access to those that need it, remove it when it's not required, review it on a regular basis. And then things get a little bit trickier. So shared accounts, we all know we want to avoid them where possible. In an operational environment, there are often legitimate needs to actually have shared accounts. One of the ones that I would see quite regularly is a lot of the safety monitoring workstations where people are watching trains down the rail corridor. It's not actually possible for those people to, at the end of a shift, log off and have someone else log on, because that means there's that window where no one's actually monitoring that system. So those people have a legitimate need to actually share an account. So where you have those legitimate needs, and make sure you double check them because people will say they need it and they probably don't. But look at stuff like limiting the access of the shared accounts. Make sure those shared accounts are locked to that particular workstation so they don't have a dynamic login that can be used elsewhere. Make sure you have those shared workstations in a physically separate part of the building. And make sure you're actually logging staff who are on shift so that you can attribute any actions that are taken on that account at that time. Passwords. I'm not going to go through basic password requirements because you folks should hopefully understand them. But one of the big things is changing of default vendor passwords. In a lot of operational technology contexts, vendors won't actually let you do that. And it will be a violation of your support contract if you change that default password, because they're probably lazy and they want to be able to log in with the same password to all of their customers. So double check if this is in fact a requirement of your vendor. If it is in a support contract, try to get it taken out and be able to actually change that default password. You also want to have separate identity management to your enterprise environment. So don't go to all the trouble of segregating everything out and then have one Active Directory managing everything. Have a separate Active Directory for your enterprise environment. Use a centralized password management platform for your system and your infrastructure credentials. And also make sure your service accounts are non-interactive because they should be for services and not for people. So number 4, configuration management and hardening. So this is kind of a mishmash of different things. You want to be looking at limiting and restricting removable media so that USBs people are plugging in, you don't want those. You want to make sure you've got version integrity monitoring for your PLCs. You want to disable services and components that you don't actually need. Again, that's some basic hygiene stuff. Make sure you're not storing credentials in clear text, particularly within config scripts and that kind of thing. If you can, have a standard operating environment that you use for everything in your environment. That way it keeps it nice and consistent. You know what's happening. You don't have to actually think about what's switched on for each thing. Disabling insecure and legacy protocols and use secure alternatives where possible. So we all know this, SSH for SFTP, not Telnet and FTP. This one's actually a really difficult one to do a lot of the time. So if you can do it, good job. I envy you. And finally, where you do have exceptions to a lot of these things, because you probably will, particularly with those legacy protocols, actually record them. Weird idea. Have some governance around it, actually know where they are, keep track of them. If you can get rid of them down the track, then do it. But you're not going to be able to do that without actually having a record of where they are and why they're there. So this is some pretty basic threat and vulnerability management stuff, but it can be quite difficult to do in operational environments because you are working around all of that segregation as well. So have monitoring in place for your mission critical OT systems. There's actually a bunch of vendors these days that sell appliances specifically designed for operational networks. So you've got Nozomi, Clarity, Dragos are all selling that kind of thing. So those are specifically designed for those environments, which makes them a better product. They're not designed for an enterprise environment and then you just stick it in there and hope it picks something up. Patching, again, quite difficult when you are not connecting to the internet and you're trying not to implement too many changes and you have very small change windows, but patch everything that you can. And also make sure that your vendors are patching the things that they're responsible for, because a lot of the time they will try to get away with not doing it. And also make sure in a lot of cases you will be reliant on vendors to actually test that whatever they sell you actually works on a new operating system. Make sure you're working with them to make sure they do it in a timely fashion and you're not sitting around waiting for them to do that testing before you can actually roll that patch out. And finally, actually deploy antivirus and make sure you do update it and have some central management within your OT environment. Again, not from your enterprise environment. I'm going to keep hammering that point home. So end-of-life systems. Actually identify them, because I can guarantee you they are there. They are 100% there, they're hidden. And in a lot of places you might not be able to actually upgrade them. So actually identify them first to start with. Make sure you have plans to actually replace and upgrade and actually put those into the budget. I know a lot of us don't like having to do the management side of things, actually, add the numbers up and see what you can afford to do. But you need to do that for these end-of-life systems, because otherwise you're never going to be able to get away from them. And finally, where you can't, and I can guarantee you there will be ones that you can't, because that particular vendor only sells that product to run on Windows 98 and they have no interest in upgrading it, so you're stuck with it. Actually look at what you can do to limit its exposure. So have extra restricted access, have targeted monitoring, extra isolated and segmented away, run it in a VLAN, whatever you can do to actually try to put some extra layers of protection around it. So resilience and recovery. Here we are looking at single points of failure. There will be some. Try to make them not be. Very good advice. Make sure you actually have processes in place to perform and test backups. And this should go for both data and for configuration. So if you've got system logic or PLC logic, converter firmware, make sure you're actually backing up the configs for those devices, because if you have to configure them all from scratch, you are not going to be having a good time. So actually test that those backups will work. Make sure you've got BCP and DR for OT systems and actually test them, which is the step that most people forget. And actually run through those tests and then work any findings back into your plan. And finally, make sure you actually know who to call, which isn't Ghostbusters in this context, if there is actually an incident. I mean, maybe you've got ghosts in your OT network, I don't know. But make sure you know who to call. The thing with a lot of these OT networks is they are very physically isolated. A lot of them are out in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how many of you have been to the Pilbara, but it's a big red nothing with a mine in the middle. So make sure when something goes wrong, the people out in the middle of nowhere know who to call. And if you're in the office looking out, make sure you know who's on site who can help you if you actually detect something. Because getting to talk to the right person is probably 90% of your battle in a lot of these situations. And finally, I know the governance piece is all of your favourite one. So actually keep track of some stuff. Have an asset register, have a vendor register. Make sure you have contracts in place. Include cybersecurity within your contracts. Include ongoing support and maintenance in your contracts. Make sure you actually tell your vendor that you have cybersecurity requirements before you engage with them, and then make sure that they can meet them, and then come back later and make sure they're still meeting them. And make sure you have processes to capture any exceptions. So where things can't abide by the best things that you want to do, keep a record of it, come back to it, fix them later if you can, Put extra protections where you can't, and make sure people actually know about them, because the worst thing is not actually knowing where you have any of these vulnerabilities. You can't secure what you can't see. So, my somewhat vague case study. I have taken a couple of different risk assessments that I and my team worked on while I was at my previous employer, and I've combined them into something that's indicative of what we saw but isn't giving away any commercially sensitive or proprietary information. And there is someone from my former employer here, and I can see him watching me. So I will be careful, but this is very common, and this is what we were seeing in basically everything that we did. So let's say hypothetically, you had a drill, a very, very big drill in the middle of nowhere. And this is a very fancy, very expensive autonomous drilling system. So there's a few things that go into an autonomous drilling system. First of all, you have your big, big drill. Then you have a human operator who is controlling that drill. And that human operator is probably thousands of kilometers away from the drill, is controlling it through a computer, and is probably controlling 6 to 10 drills at any one time. So for them to be able to do that, there's an onboard system on that drill that tells the drill what to do from the operator. You've also got your control room where your operator's working, and ideally you have a backup control room. And then you've got connectivity between all of those things. So what are we concerned about with this setup? Well, first of all, drills are very big and very scary. The internet is also a very big and very scary place. So if you have a drill that's controlled by the internet, you can kind of see where I'm going with that. And there's some things you need to consider. So for example, when you stop drilling, you stop making money. And we're in WA. I don't need to tell you how important mining is for our economy. Well, I'm not going to get into that. But if you lose 1 week of production, it's actually going to take you more than a month to make that up. And that's actually millions of dollars. I mean, if you think of the price of iron ore and how many millions of tons of iron ore we are shipping out from WA every day, it adds up pretty quick. And those big, big drills are also very expensive to repair if something goes wrong. So some of the parts on that drill cost $300,000 just on their own. And that doesn't include the cost it takes to fly a technician from Perth out into the middle of nowhere, probably drive a couple of 1,000 kilometres into the middle of nowhere, and they're going to charge you quite a bit because they don't want to do it. So those dollars add up pretty quick as well. So let's say you did a risk assessment on an autonomous drilling system. These might be some of the things that you would find as part of that risk assessment. So for example, in the category of segregation, you might find a stray corporate server has direct access into your OT network. And I'm pretty sure I've said 27 times already that that's not a great thing. You might also find that some systems that are responsible for software configuration or change management or infrastructure management, they're actually located in your corporate network and have been given direct access into your operational network. You might also look at the firewall rules that you have and realize that some of them are quite permissive and they're not actually reviewed very regularly. So moving on to segmentation, you might look at your OT network and realize that there is not a lot of segmentation actually going on there. So any of your systems and devices can communicate with each other even where they don't need to. So as I think I mentioned earlier, if you get malware on your truck, it's very easy for it to spread to your drill, and no one wants a malwared drill. If you were to look at access management, you might find that you have some backup workstations that are left logged on at all times. They're always unlocked. They're unattended a lot of the time, so anyone could wander in. You might have a physical e-stop switch, which is your big red button that absolutely stops everything in the case of an emergency. That might be left unattended, and it's pretty easily accessible as well. You might have a lot of vendor default passwords in that environment. You might have some service account creds stored in clear text. I don't need to tell you folks what that can be used for. And you might also find credentials written on whiteboards and on post-its within your control room. And you get bonus points for that one if there's CCTV pointed at those whiteboards and post-its as well. So you're probably going to have some bad security hygiene. You haven't been washing your hands for 20 seconds. So you've still got some legacy and insecure communication protocols. There's going to be some Telnet, some FTP, some HTTP. You've probably got a legacy AD integration method lurking in there somewhere. You're probably not great on patching, and you probably don't have any antivirus on those servers. And when it comes to actually looking at what's happened and what's been happening and what has happened, you probably have no idea because you haven't been logging and you haven't centralized that, so you don't amalgamate all of that data to give you the full picture, and no one's really looking at it anyway. So once you know all this, what do you actually do? The simple solution is to fix it. And if you go to some stakeholders and tell them that, they're probably not going to give you a very happy response. So it's not actually as easy to fix a lot of these things as we might think. And a big long list of to-dos for people who are already overworked, and admittedly they're probably fairly well paid because I'm talking about the mining industry, but they're very busy. And they're just trying to keep the lights on. So having these security folk roll in and go, actually, you suck, here's some stuff to suck less, isn't going to go down very well. But you can actually do some things. So let's say we start off with the process side of things. We can probably put in some processes for account reviews. We can actually do some firewall rule reviews and actually fix them once you've reviewed them and pointed out what's wrong. You can change your process so that you have password updates when you are commissioning new hardware. You can start doing some patching within your OT network within those tiny change windows that you have. You can go and mop up all of those default vendor passwords that you can. You can roll out something like CyberArk for password management. You can get rid of that naughty legacy AD integration module, fix that one up. You can deploy antivirus, and you can start doing centralized logging and monitoring with one of those products that I mentioned earlier. So you've done all of this stuff, and things are actually looking a bit better, but what's actually left? Network segregation enforcement, very, very, very tricky. That's why I keep saying that you need to do it, because it's actually really hard, particularly if you haven't done it from the beginning. Going through and clearing out all of those connections and re-engineering existing solutions so that they don't need those connections is a very messy and expensive job. So you've done some of it, you're doing well, but there's still a lot left to do. And if you haven't done that segregation piece, the chances of you actually getting to that segmentation piece are pretty low. And removing all of those legacy and insecure protocols, you're shit out of luck on that one. It's just not going to happen. So this is what got done in 3 years. And there's still probably another 3 years of work left. So what did we actually learn during this process? Well, number one, security is hard, particularly in large and complex environments. But there's really only one way to deal with that. And a good friend of mine often says you just have to eat the elephant, which is just start eating. Like, bite by bite, you'll get there eventually. The second thing I learned was that getting to the right people in your organization is half the battle. And when you have an organization that's about 50,000 people and you are spread across the world and you have a division between office people and site people, it's even more difficult to actually find who you need to talk to, get them on board, and actually start getting this work done. But once you find that person, and there's always the person, they know where all the bodies are buried, they know where all the connections are that don't need to be there. Once you find that person and you get them on board, shit happens, and it does happen. And finally, sustainability really is the key to a lot of this stuff. There's no point actually fixing a problem if you haven't gone and actually created a process behind it that will actually stop it happening again. Because unless you're a contractor who wants your 1-year project to be renewed at the end of the year, you don't want to get to the end of fixing all this stuff and then realize you have to go and fix it in all the other places that it's happened again. So actually making sure you have those processes to stop it happening in the future, drawing that line in the sand and saying, we're not going to do it like that anymore, and then we're going to mop up, will actually mean that you have sustainably fixed that problem. So that's the end. I don't think I'm going to have time for questions. Oh, cool. I do have time for questions. Remarkable. That was a very quick hand up.
Just as far as the framework is concerned for your risk assessments, is there anything that you do that you recommend using?
Specifically for operational technology?
Whatever the case is in an OT environment, is there something that...
There is actually, if you're looking at MITRE, there's a specific MITRE for operational environments, which I find really handy. I'm not a huge fan of the stride stuff, but I just kind of mash everything together, to be honest. I find that's what works for me. But MITRE for the operational side of things is probably the best bet. Yeah?
Quick one. Is ICS and OT the same thing, or are they different? Is it just a rebranding, or is it...
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. So operational technology and ICS is industrial control systems. So operational technology is probably more of an umbrella term, and under that you would have ICS and then, you know, different other forms of technology, but the terms generally are used fairly interchangeably. And there's a lot of other terms. Some places will call it industrial and operational technology. Some places call it production technology. It just depends what vernacular you want to lean into. Yes. With not well, to be honest. There's a lot of, it's not a perfect solution, but it's better than not having absolutely anything, to be honest. Yeah. But yeah, there's, things can go wrong, but for the most part, if you've set it up correctly and you've done your testing, you should be able to run it. There's a guy over there who can talk to you a bit more about antivirus and operational technology. Okay, all right, lucky last. Right down the back.
Given the lack of connectivity remotely out here, do you see many people moving to, say, like satellite backhaul or OT technology like 4Com or stuff like that?
I don't think there will be a move just because once it gets cheaper probably, but what a lot of those companies are doing is just building their own mobile networks at the moment. So they'll have their own one. They're not working through Telstra or anything like that. They'll build that out in the middle of nowhere, and that's what they use. And sometimes they won't even connect back to the internet. It's basically just a LAN that runs on 3G or 4G. But hopefully, you know, if Elon Musk brings us all the cheap satellite he's promised, it might be a proper solution going forward, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. Cool. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll be around the rest of the weekend.
Thanks, Cairo.